I remember that evening with the kind of clarity one reserves for small, inconsequential things, the creak of a radiator, the faint smell of dust rising from a carpet long overdue for beating, the peculiar light that seems to linger in Oxford even when the day is gone. I was walking through Radcliffe Square, coat collar turned against the drizzle, when I saw a note, pale against the darkness, pressed behind the glass of a library window. It wasn't the sort of thing one would expect to see there, among the solemn notices about lectures and lost umbrellas. The handwriting was deliberate, though not elegant. Words shaped by impatience, perhaps by fear. I would have walked past, indeed, I nearly did, had it not been for a small tear in the paper's corner, as though someone had written it in haste and pinned it in regret. I cannot say what made me stop. Habit, perhaps. The detective's curse of curiosity disguised as moral duty. The words, when I leaned close enough to read them, were few. 3 lines, no name, but they spoke of something hidden, buried, the writer said, not on earth, but in silence. And then a reference to the old wing, after dusk. I remember thinking how absurdly theatrical it sounded, the kind of thing undergraduates compose after 2 sherries and a quarrel. And yet I couldn't walk away. There is always that moment, small, invisible, when an ordinary evening tilts into something else, and one's life bends around it forever. Inside, the library was nearly empty. The air was thick with that monastic stillness peculiar to old colleges, the quiet breathing of paper, the faint hum of a fluorescent tube that should have been replaced years ago. The librarian looked up briefly, perhaps wondering if I had come to return something long overdue. In a way, I had thought neither of us knew it then. I walked the aisles slowly. There is a peculiar intimacy in libraries after hours, as though each book were a witness. Dust rose in delicate threads as I passed. Somewhere a clock struck 7. The sound seemed to fold the air. The old wing, mentioned in the note, was closed to students, a small annex beyond the main stacks, accessible only through a narrow passage where the stone floor dipped slightly. The door there was locked, of course, but the key was never far. It hung, as it always had, behind the librarian's desk. I have never quite decided whether I borrowed it or stole it. Inside, the air was colder, stiller. I could smell old leather, candle wax long extinct, the residue of lives once spent reading themselves into oblivion. And then I saw a desk near the far wall, an open book, a half-burned candle in a brass holder. Nothing remarkable, except for the fact that the wax was still warm. Someone had been there not long before me. I remember standing in that dim room, the faint echo of rain against the glass, and feeling that strange sensation that comes when thought races ahead of comprehension. I glanced around the scattered papers, the faint imprint of an elbow on the desk's surface, and there, on the floor near the skirting board, another fragment of the same paper as the note, torn away, blank on one side, on the reverse, faintly penciled words, "Ask the porter." I left quietly, though the door groaned its complaint. The librarian was gone, and the clock showed nearly 8. Outside, the rain had hardened, slicking the stones into mirrors. I went to the porter's lodge, based on instinct more than decision. Old Jenkins was there, as he had been since my student days, his face the colour of overbrewed tea. He didn't seem surprised to see me. There are few things in Oxford that surprise anyone anymore. He said something about a young man who had been asking for me. Said he'd left a message but thought better of it. That he'd seemed troubled. I asked for a name. He frowned. Couldn't recall. Only that he was pale, distracted, and spoke softly. And that he had mentioned, curiously enough, the old wing. When I turned to go, Jenkins called after me. Said he'd found something earlier that day on the window ledge by the library. a torn envelope, damp from the rain. He'd kept it, thinking it might matter. It did. There, in the corner of the envelope, faint and smudged, were two initials, one of them my own. It was the shoes that stayed with me. Not the face, nor the blood, nor even the whispering hush that always follows the discovery of a body in a place built for thought. The shoes, brown leather, scuffed, slightly too small for the boy who wore them, stood neatly by the edge of the carpet, as if waiting for him to rise and step back into them. He was a student at St. Friddiswide's, I was told. Second year studying classics, though that description, I have found, covers a multitude of sins. His name, Andrew Lacey, meant nothing to me at first, but the porter's tone had shifted slightly when he said it, the way one's voice does when recalling a kindness undeserved. He was found in his room, though calling it a room was generous. The college had long ago converted attics into student quarters, wooden beams, thin plaster, the smell of dust and unwashed socks. He lay on the bed, one arm folded beneath him, his head turned towards the wall as though mid-thought. No sign of violence, no note, just an open book of poetry on the desk and the shoes at the floor's edge. I remember the stillness. There's a kind of hush particular to Oxford death scenes, as if the centuries themselves have paused to listen. The college nurse was whispering to someone about sedatives. The dean stood by the window, avoiding my eyes. I asked how long he'd been dead. The nurse said perhaps 3 hours, evening time, long enough for the air to settle, for the radiator's tick to become unbearable. I asked if anyone had seen him. She mentioned a friend, Martin Crowe, who had gone to fetch him for dinner, found the door locked, and called the porter. I could already hear the excuses forming: stress, exams, and melancholy. Oxford offers so many words for despair, but it was the shoes that would not leave me. They were dry, though the quad outside had been soaked with rain since afternoon. If he had returned recently, they would have been damp, the soles darkened by the stone. Yet they were bone dry, placed with almost ceremonial precision, as though by someone else's hand. I walked around the small room, a kettle on the shelf, a cracked mug, a crossword half completed in the margin of a newspaper. One clue had been circled twice in pencil: means of escape 5. The answer, I saw, was not yet filled in. Something about that detail disturbed me more than I cared to admit. When Crowe arrived, he looked like every clever, nervous undergraduate I'd ever encountered, defensive courtesy masking guilt, guilt masking fear. He said Andrew had been quiet lately, working late in the library, reading things he didn't understand, muttering about someone watching him. He laughed when he said it, but the laugh was thin. I asked whether Andrew had mentioned anyone specific. Crowe hesitated, then said only, "There was a note in the window, sir." I felt the faint, familiar tightening in my chest. He meant that note. I asked when Andrew had last been seen alive. Crowe thought it might have been early evening, near the Bodleian. Andrew had said he needed to fetch something from the old wing. He'd been gone less than an hour. When he didn't appear for dinner, Crowe assumed he'd gone to his tutorials or perhaps met a girl. I asked if Andrew had many friends. Crowe shrugged. "Only books, sir." As he spoke, I looked again at the shoes, polished but creased, the left slightly more worn at the heel, suggesting a limp, or at least the memory of one. The laces were tied unevenly to the left loop, shorter than the right. But these were neatly aligned, toe to skirting board, as though staged. Death rarely arranges itself with such tidiness. The college clock struck midnight as I left. The rain had stopped, but the stones still glistened. Somewhere behind me, a student laughed, oblivious, the kind of laughter that sounds too close to fear. Back in my flat, I poured a small whiskey and sat by the window. My notes were a few dry shoes, open book, crossword clue. The trifles of a quiet mind, yet trifles are the currency of truth, means of escape. 5 letters, a word formed in my head, and with it the faint sense of something tilting beneath the surface. But I pushed it aside. The night was long, and there are moments one must let the silence do the thinking. It was the chapel that drew me back to St. Frideswide's that morning. Not out of devotion God, and I have long observed a courteous distance, but because I had learned, over years of inquiry, that sanctuaries tend to hold more secrets than prayers. The porter unlocked the oak door with a key that looked older than his conscience. The air inside was chilled, scented faintly with wax and damp hymn books. Light filtered through the stained glass in fractured bands of crimson and blue, falling upon pews polished smooth by the elbows of generations who had knelt more from habit than faith. It was there, in that softened light, that I found the faintest residue of sound, a hum, perhaps, or the ghost of one. I have always believed that voices cling to places, the way perfume lingers in an empty room. Andrew Lacey, the dead student, had sung in the chapel choir. His name appeared in the register by the organ stall. A neat signature, almost girlish in its curve. Beneath it, another Martin Crowe's. They had sung together for 2 terms, alternating the same part. I have never trusted coincidences that hide in plain sight. The chaplain appeared from the vestry, soft-footed, as though reluctant to disturb the past. He remembered the boy well. Said he had a fine voice, though lately strained. Had stopped attending rehearsals 2 weeks before the end of term. When pressed, he mentioned an incident after evensong quarrel overheard behind the organ pipes between Lacey and an older don. The subject, he said, had been scholarship money, but there was something in his tone, a hesitancy too deliberate to be natural. He gestured to the east window, the one depicting St. Frideswide's martyrdom. Said that Lacey had taken to sitting beneath it after services, staring up for long stretches. Some thought him praying, others thought him ill. I asked whether he had confessed anything. The chaplain's eyes flickered with guilt or discretion, impossible to tell. He murmured that the boy had seemed frightened, though of what he couldn't say. I stood there beneath the coloured glass and tried to see what the boy had seen. The saint's expression was calm, almost serene, as the painted soldiers approached her. But at her feet, barely visible unless one stooped close, a small inscription wound through the stonework line of Latin I half remembered from school. Veritas in lumine. Truth in the light. That phrase would haunt me later, though I did not yet know why. I walked to the choir stalls. The sheet music lay open on the stand, left from the previous night's rehearsal. The hymn, Abide With Me. Beneath the notes, penciled in faintly, were letters ADS. I thought at first they were initials, until I noticed the small crosses separating them. In musical notation, those letters form a descending minor phrase. A DSA dies solis, the day of the sun, or perhaps Sunday. The last day Lacey was seen alive. A sound startled me, a door closing softly at the far end. A woman's silhouette passed briefly across the coloured glass. She carried a broom and a look that belonged to those who see much and speak little. The chapel cleaner. I called her and she paused but did not approach. Her name, I later learned, was Mrs. Bell. She said she'd found something the morning after the boy's death, a scrap of paper beneath the organ bench. She hadn't mentioned it before because she'd assumed it was part of the choir's notes. I asked if she still had it. She hesitated, then reached into her apron and drew out a folded corner of manuscript paper, slightly torn. On it, in small, deliberate handwriting, were 4 words I heard them sing. I asked her who she thought they were. She crossed herself before answering. Said there had been whispers that night, though the chapel had been empty. A sort of low chanting, she called it, not unholy exactly, but wrong. She'd left the building quickly and hadn't gone back until morning. Outside, the bell began to toll the hour, dull and echoing. The sound filled the space like smoke. I thanked her, though the words felt heavy. She returned to her sweeping as if nothing had passed between us. As I stepped into the courtyard, the sunlight briefly pierced the clouds, casting the chapel's stained glass colours across the stone. For an instant, they formed a pattern crimson, blue, gold-like some untranslatable code, and then it was gone. There are societies within societies in Oxford, and most of them wear their secrecy like a borrowed cloak-grand in posture, threadbare upon inspection. The fellowship at St. Frida's, however, was of another order entirely. Its existence was never denied, yet never quite confirmed. One heard of it only through fragments of conversation, half-smiles in common rooms, the faint perfume of privilege that drifts behind closed oak doors. It was Crow who mentioned it first, almost carelessly, as if unaware of the gravity of his own remark. A gathering of dons, he said, that met every month for private discussion, ethics, philosophy, college finances. The usual pretences. But Andrew Lacey had been there once, he added, his tone tightening on the word once. I found myself walking that afternoon to the senior common room, the kind of place that smells perpetually of old port, polished brass, and long-decayed ambition. A portrait of the founder gazed down from the far wall, his eyes clouded with centuries of moral compromise. At a table near the hearth sat Dr. Quentin Voss, Dean of Studies, his tweed jacket immaculate, his manner too still. He greeted me with a politeness that had edges. We discussed the boy in vague, procedural tones, but I sensed the weariness beneath his calm. I asked, almost idly, whether the fellowship had known the student. His expression did not change, though his fingers moved slightly, once, twice upon the armrest. A small, rhythmic pulse, like a man silently counting time. He said the fellowship concerned itself with ideas, not individuals. I told him that in my experience the two were rarely so easily separated. He smiled, and I disliked the smile. I let the silence sit, long enough for discomfort to show itself. Eventually he offered tea, which I declined. He mentioned that the boy had been bright but troubled, the sort of student who mistook intellect for understanding. I thought that description could apply to half the city. When I rose to leave, Voss said something curious that Andrew had been fascinated by truth, but only the kind that could not be proven. Outside, the rain had returned, thin and persistent. I crossed the quad, pausing beneath the cloisters where gargoyles watched with blank patience. The porter, Jenkins, was hurrying past with a bundle of papers, but stopped when he saw me. Said there'd been a visitor asking for Andrew the night before his death, a man not of the college, older, wearing a dark coat. He'd waited in the shadows near the gate, left when told the boy wasn't in. Jenkins thought nothing of it at the time. I did. In the evening I returned to my room, took down the file, and read the statements again. The chaplain, the nurse, and Crowwheel circled something unsaid. I poured a whiskey, opened the crossword that lay beside me. 5 across hidden group, quietly influencing events. 10. The answer came almost too quickly. Brotherhood. It was a trivial coincidence, perhaps, but my mind rarely allows such words to rest. The fellowship, the quarrel in the chapel, the note in the library all seemed to hum faintly with the same frequency, as though parts of a single, forgotten melody. Later, I found myself standing at the window, watching the lights of the college across the street. Behind one, a figure moved briefly, then vanished. I thought of Lacey, sitting beneath the stained glass, searching for truth in the light, and wondered what kind of truth the fellowship had promised him. In the quiet, I recalled a conversation I once overheard in that very room years earlier, two senior fellows murmuring about reputation, about the necessity of discretion when ideals became inconvenient. The words had meant little then. Now they returned with an uneasy resonance. I returned to my desk, opened the folder of photographs from the scene. The shoes, the book, the crossword. But something new struck me. The book on the desk, a collection of poems by Matthew Arnold. The page left open bore a line I had not noticed before: "Truth sits upon the lips of dying men." The margin showed a faint pencil mark beside it. Lacey's hand, perhaps, or someone else's. Either way, it was enough. I wrote a single note in my ledger: "Ask Voss about Arnold." When I closed the file, the clock on my shelf ticked past midnight. Outside, the bells began to sound again, slow, deliberate, as if marking not the hour, but the weight of it. I poured another whiskey and listened to the rain tracing the glass. The city slept, but I could not. There are nights in Oxford when the past whispers louder than any living voice. And that night, I began to hear it. The letter arrived 2 mornings later, though the postmark told me it had been sent before the boy died. Oxford has a curious sense of time, letters wandering, memories arriving early, and truth is always delayed. It was folded twice without envelope, the handwriting small and angular, almost apologetic. My name was written at the top, not as a formality, but as if whispered. Inside, only 4 lines. You were right about them. I can't unhear what I heard. It wasn't meant for me, but I think they know I was there. Signed, simply, A.L. There are few moments in my life when my pulse has quickened. This was one of them. The note was not found among his belongings. Jenkins, the porter, said it had been slipped under the police station door during the night. No return address, no witnesses. The paper smelled faintly of old books and, oddly, incense. I sat with it for a long time, letting my mind wander through the echoes of that final sentence. They know I was there, not he, not she, they. A plural guilt, collective and practiced. I thought again of the fellowship, that discreet conclave of academics who met in shadowed rooms to discuss ethics by candlelight. A phrase from the chaplain's sermon drifted back to me, truth in the light. Perhaps light, in Oxford, was the most dangerous place of all. By mid-afternoon I found myself in the Bodleian, following an impulse that had no logic beyond habit. The library was quiet, its air thick with the dust of 1,000 unconfessed sins. I asked the archivist for the fellowship records, knowing full well they would not exist, but he led me to an index of alumni publications instead. The name I sought, Voss, appeared often: essays on morality, conscience, silence. The titles felt like small, deliberate provocations. On one shelf I found a slim volume of his lectures. I opened it to a random page. There, underlined faintly in pencil, a quotation from Newman. Knowledge is one thing, virtue another. Someone, Lacey, I suspected, had written a word beside it: lies. I felt in that moment an odd sympathy for the boy. To be young, clever, and disillusioned in Oxford is a particular tragedy. The city feeds on such souls. As I turned to leave, I noticed the librarian watching me. A woman in her 60s, pale, with the distant gaze of someone accustomed to secrets. She said softly that Lacey had often sat at that same table, always the same chair, near the north window. He'd been reading something forbidden, she thought, because he always closed it quickly when approached. Once, she said, she'd seen a piece of paper fall from between the pages, which he'd snatched up before she could glimpse it. I asked if she remembered which book. She hesitated, then pointed. A collection of sermons by a certain Reverend Collingwood, once the college chaplain, long dead. I opened it. The spine cracked faintly, like an exhale. Inside, pressed between two yellowed pages, was a second letter. Not Lacey's hand this time, older, assured, written with ink that had bled faintly through the paper. The circle must remain closed. There can be no forgiveness without silence, no signature. I felt the weight of it more than the boy's fear, the chaplain's unease, Voss's evasions, and through it all, that word they, like a choral echo. Back outside, the rain had begun again, soft and ceaseless. The Radcliffe camera loomed in the mist, its dome a pale ghost above the cobbles. I walked without direction until I found myself in the narrow lane behind the chapel. The windows there were dim, but faintly, just faintly, I heard voices. Not words, but tones, a cadence that was neither prayer nor song. It lasted only a moment, then the silence returned, vast and indifferent. At home I placed the letters side by side on my desk, a boy's plea and a man's warning. Between them lay everything Oxford does best, concealment in the language of intellect. I thought again of the crossword clue, means of escape. 5, I had filled it in days ago, then crossed it out. Now I wrote it again, slowly, as though solving it for the first time. Truth. But as I stared at the word, it looked increasingly foreign, stripped of meaning. Somewhere a clock chimed 9. I folded both letters, placed them inside a file and closed the drawer. The night pressed against the window like an unanswered question. And I, foolishly, still believed that letters could tell the truth. There are few things in this life I trust, but among them is the simple certainty of a crossword grid. A world reduced to pattern and reason, each answers a small act of redemption. It was late, perhaps too late, when I sat with that day's puzzle before me, the rain tracing patient hieroglyphs down the window. The room smelled faintly of smoke and solitude. I had poured one whiskey more than the reason allowed. The clue that held me was a short one, almost innocent. Faith abandoned, logic retained. 8. I stared at it longer than necessary, tasting the irony. Apostate. The word arrived quietly like an apology. And with it, the memory of a conversation I had almost forgotten. Andrew Lacey in the porter's logbook, visiting the chapel after hours, signing his name beside another, erased but still legible beneath the pressure of the pen. A. Lacey above, Voss below, the apostate. A man who rejects his faith yet cannot escape its shadow. I had seen that look before on men who claim reason as their god, but tremble before the irrational. Voss, with his clipped tone and eyes that never rested, had seemed almost relieved by the boy's death. Not from malice, but from release. There are truths that burden both teacher and pupil, and I sensed he carried one heavy enough to break the spine. I took out the letters again. The boy's desperate scrawl, they knew I was there. The older hand's warning, the circle must remain closed. Between them, silence is more articulate than speech. Somewhere in that gap was the reason the boy died. The next morning I returned to St. Fridayswide's, though the porter looked less than pleased. He said the fellowship was meeting that afternoon, an unscheduled gathering, private. His voice lingered on the word as though it meant more than it should. I left my card on the counter and said I might call again. In the quad the rain had paused, leaving the stones slick as thought. I sat beneath the cloister arch and opened the crossword once more, half for distraction, half for intuition. One down, unseen truth, revealed by light EX. Reflexively I wrote it in. Veritas. The same word is carved beneath the stained glass in the chapel. Truth in the light. I began to see the shape forming. The boy had sought something buried, not gold or gossip, but knowledge denied to him. Perhaps he had overheard their discussion, recorded it, and confronted them. Perhaps that was the quarrel the chaplain spoke of, but my mind resisted the simplicity. Oxford never kills for one reason alone. It kills for reputation, for fear, for love disguised as principle. I found myself walking without direction, ending at the cloister door that led to the Fellows' staircase. The corridor beyond smelled of varnish and ink. I heard voices, low and deliberate, from the room above. I lingered, not eavesdropping exactly, more like listening for ghosts. A phrase drifted down, caught between echoes, something about preservation. Then another discipline. The tone was calm, scholarly, almost gentle. Yet beneath it ran the unmistakable current of concealment. When the door opened, I stepped back into the shadows. Voss emerged, his features composed, his hand adjusting his cuff with mechanical precision. He passed without seeing me, though his expression carried the faint satisfaction of a man whose decision has been made. I did not follow. Some truths reveal themselves best at a distance. That evening I returned to my room and laid the crossword before me, once again. The grid was nearly full now, save for the final clue. End of faith, beginning of truth. 4. The answer came slowly, almost unwillingly. Loss, it fit perfectly. The pattern complete, I set the paper aside and stared at the whiskey in my hand, its surface trembling faintly in the lamplight. The rain had resumed, harder now, drumming against the panes like muted applause. In the stillness, I thought of the boy again, his shoes aligned, his face turned to the wall, his last message unsigned. Perhaps he had been the apostate, searching for a kind of truth too dangerous to live with. Or perhaps the apostasy belonged to others, the ones who preached virtue and practiced silence. Either way, the crossword was solved. Yet nothing felt resolved. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the rain drown the bells. The clues had given their answers, but Oxford never does. There are hours in Oxford when time seems to dissolve, the hour after midnight most of all. The city exhales, the stones cool, the scholars sleep, and even guilt grows weary. I was sitting in my office, the rain folding against the window like some tired argument, when the telephone rang. The voice on the line was the chaplain's, quiet, breathless words tumbling as if pushed by conscience. He said someone had come to him, that I should come at once before dawn. There was no need for explanation. The voice alone carried the weight of something final. I remember the walk through the college grounds, how the rain had softened into mist, how my footsteps seemed to echo off unseen walls. In the chapel, only one candle burned, the pews stretched away like shadows. And there, beneath the stained glass window, sat Dr. Quentin Voss. His head bowed, his hands clasped as if in prayer. The chaplain stood apart, uneasy. He whispered that Voss had asked for absolution, though not in the ecclesiastical sense. I told him to leave us. He did. The door closed with a sigh. Voss raised his head slowly. The candlelight caught the hollows of his face, the weary geometry of a man undone by the logic he worshipped. He spoke without looking at me, said he'd heard I'd found the letters, that I must have guessed by now. I told him guessing was for men with time to waste. He smiled faintly, almost grateful for the cruelty. Then he began to speak. Not in confession exactly, but in recollection. He said that Andrew had been chosen, mentored, cultivated. The fellowship admired his mind, his precision. But intellect, he said, is a dangerous appetite. The boy had started asking questions, reading what was forbidden, questioning their purpose. He stopped as though a weight had lodged behind his ribs. I asked him what that purpose had been. He said it began as an idea, an inquiry into moral limits. Could truth survive without faith? Could faith endure without deception? The fellowship had sought to prove that moral certainty was an illusion, and Andrew, young, brilliant, had believed them. Until he didn't. Voss looked at me then, and I saw the faint trembling in his jaw, the exhaustion of belief betrayed. He said Andrew had confronted them after a meeting and accused them of hypocrisy, that there had been words, anger, that no one had meant harm, only silence. Only silence. I asked him about the note, the one in the library window. His eyes closed briefly. The boy had written it, he said, hoping someone might understand before it was too late. He'd been there that night, Voss admitted, when the boy fell. Not by violence, but by despair. He had left him alone, believing solitude would soothe him. When he returned, the candle was still burning, the shoes aligned. The boy is already gone. There are lies that confess themselves, and there are truths that sound like mercy. I could not tell which this was. The chapel clock struck 3. Outside, the rain began again, thin as thread. I asked him what he wanted from me. He said only this, that the world does not make the boy a villain, that his name be remembered as one who sought truth, even when it cost him faith. He paused, said that was the only absolution left worth seeking. He rose then, as though to leave, but lingered beneath the window. The candlelight caught the inscription below the glass, Veritas in lumine. He traced the words with a finger, almost tenderly. Truth in the light. Then he turned, said softly that some truths are better left in the dark. I did not stop him. When I left the chapel, dawn had begun to bleed into the sky, pale and unwilling. I walked across the quad, hearing again the rain on stone, the soft chime of morning bells. Back in my room, I opened my notebook and wrote 3 lines. Voss confessed, no crime in law, only in silence. Then I poured a whisky, though it was far too early, and stared at the crossword still open on my desk. 7 across sin concealed within virtue 7. I filled it in without hesitation. Silence, it fit perfectly, too perfect. It arrived without warning, like most things that matter. A small parcel, unmarked, left on my doorstep in the rain. Inside, wrapped in brown paper and tied with thin string, lay a blue diary, its leather cracked, its corners darkened by handling. I knew it before I opened it. Lacey's. The same shade of ink he'd used in his notes, the same faint scent of dust and candle smoke that clung to his room. I turned it over once, as if expecting an inscription, a clue. None. Only the sense of something that had travelled far to return home. The handwriting began steady, careful, the work of a boy who wanted to be taken seriously. Latin quotations, fragments of lectures, half-finished crosswords penciled into the margins. But the tone changed as the pages turned. The lines grew smaller, denser, as though written in haste or fear. A word appeared again and again, light. Sometimes capitalized, sometimes not. Always alone, as though it had ceased to belong to any sentence. One entry caught my attention. They say the truth is revealed, but I think it is blind. The fellowship met tonight. I've seen what I shouldn't. They won't forgive another mistake. I read it 3 times, though the words said less with each repetition. There was no date, but the ink had bled slightly, rain or tears. Impossible to tell. Later, I noticed something stranger. The pages were numbered, but one was missing. Page 46 had been carefully removed, the cut clean as if by scalpel. Not torn, not folded, but excised. I ran a finger along the gap and felt the faint indentation of writing from the page beneath. QV 9 p.m. Chapel. Voss. I sat back, the whiskey untouched beside me. The night outside had deepened, the streets of Oxford washed in the quiet glow of lamps, half drowned by mist. The diary lay open before me like a confession without penance. I wondered who had sent it. The chaplain? Crow? Someone trying to absolve themselves through my curiosity. At dawn I walked to St. Friddiswide's again. The college was hushed, the stone wet from the night's rain. Jenkins the porter looked startled to see me so early, though less surprised, when I mentioned the diary. He said nothing at first, then muttered that someone had been asking for me late the previous evening, a woman he thought middle-aged, wearing gloves. He hadn't caught her name, only that she'd left something for me. He nodded toward the letter rack by the lodge. Empty now. In the chapel, the air was damp and faintly metallic. The candle stubs on the altar had burned themselves hollow. I sat in the front pew, the diary resting on my lap. It felt oddly alive, as though it carried the pulse of the boy's fear. Then I heard footsteps light, hesitant behind me. Mrs. Bell, the cleaner, appeared with her broom, pausing when she saw the book. She said she remembered it, had found it weeks ago under one of the pews, thought it belonged to one of the students. She'd meant to hand it to the chaplain, but when she opened it, she'd seen the name inside and decided otherwise. She said she'd kept it hidden at home. I didn't know why, only that it felt wrong to give it back. But last night, she'd dreamt of the boy standing beneath the window, the blue light falling on his face, and when she woke, she knew she had to return it. There was no madness in her tone, only weariness. Oxford breeds that kind of superstition, the quiet intuition that the dead never leave politely. I thanked her, though I could think of nothing adequate to say. She left, the sound of her broom fading down the aisle. I turned again to the missing page. The imprint of words on the opposite leaf deepened under angled light. 2 faint lines, legible now. The truth isn't in the light, it's in what the light hides. That was all. When I left the chapel, the morning sun had broken through the mist, its warmth pale and indifferent. I walked slowly across the quad, the diary beneath my coat, and thought of the boy, his faith, his intellect, his despair. Perhaps truth had come for him as it comes for all of us, not in revelation, but in return. The news came just after dawn, unwelcome, inevitable. Voss was dead, found in his rooms at St. Friddiswide's, slumped beside an unfinished letter and a glass that had not been raised high enough to drink. The porter said there'd been no struggle, no sign of intrusion. Only stillness, the sort Oxford reserves for its final courtesies. I arrived before the coroner. The curtains were drawn, the air stale with the smell of extinguished tobacco. On the desk the letter lay folded in 2, the first line beginning with my name. I read only as far as the second sentence before stopping. Forgive me this necessity. Truth asks too much of men who have already surrendered to reason. He had used the same blue ink as the diary. The nib of the pen still glistened faintly as though reluctant to let go. Crow stood by the window, pale, rigid, the way guilt wears itself before words arrive. He said Voss had called him the night before and asked him to collect a manuscript from the library in the morning. When Crow came at 8, the door was ajar. The kettle was still warm. He spoke quickly, as if speed might save him. I asked him what the manuscript was. He faltered, then said he hadn't looked. The porter had already fetched me by then. There was something rehearsed in his restraint. The same composure I'd seen once before in the chapel, after the choir had finished their hymn. I told him to wait outside. He did. The room was otherwise ordinary, books arranged too neatly, a half-solved crossword on the armchair, the faintest ring of whiskey around an empty glass. Yet it was the small things that unsettled me most. A chair drawn slightly askew. A matchbook from the Randolph Hotel, half-used. A photograph on the mantelvase with 3 other men, one of them the late Reverend Collingwood. The fourth was blurred, his face lost to light. On the back of the photograph, a single line of handwriting, Fratris in lumen, brothers in the light. I felt a strange chill then, not from the cold, but from recognition. The fellowship had never disbanded. It had merely grown quieter, older, more careful. And Lacey, poor Lacey, had wandered too near the flame. When the coroner arrived, I handed him the note and said as little as possible. There is a decorum in certain kinds of tragedy. One does not disturb its symmetry with facts. Outside, the rain had begun again, slow and relentless. Crow was waiting under the cloister arch, his coat collar raised, his eyes hollow. He asked if it was true that Voss had written to me. I said it was. He nodded, as though confirming something long suspected. Then he told me he was leaving Oxford, perhaps for good. He couldn't bear the sound of the bells any more. Said they made him feel watched. He paused before walking away, and in that pause I saw the smallest tremor of his hand, the same that Voss had once had, the faintest echo of a nervous tic. A shared mannerism, unremarkable until one notices it twice. The fellowship's inheritance perhaps passed through habit rather than creed. I returned to my office and set the diary beside Voss's letter. 2 voices, now joined by silence. Between them the same phrase is repeated in different forms. Truth, light, silence. I took out the crossword from Voss's room, studied the unfinished grid. 7 down, final act of reason 5. He had written the first 2 letters S and U, the rest a blank, suicide. I filled it in mechanically, then crossed it out. Too simple. Oxford never deals in single meanings. I thought of another word study. That, too, would fit. And perhaps, in its way, both were true. By evening the sun had returned, low and uncertain, casting gold across the rooftops. I walked to the river, where the air smelled faintly of moss and cold iron. The water moved, as it always does, slowly, patiently, indifferently. I thought of Lacey's shoes, of Voss's steady hand, of Crow disappearing into the rain. 2 deaths now, bound by one silence, the kind that seeps into the stone and lingers long after the living have found other explanations. When I returned home, I poured a whiskey and sat by the window. The city beyond was quiet, the lamps trembling in the dusk. Somewhere, a choir practised unseen, their voices thin as glass. For the first time I did not listen. There are voices one remembers not for what they said, but for what they failed. 2. Oxford is full of the echoes that linger in stairwells, whispers that refuse to decay. It was one such voice that returned to me that night, long after the city had gone to sleep. The call came just before midnight. Jenkins, the porter again, his tone uncertain, said there'd been movement in the chapel lights, perhaps music. I told him to lock the gates and wait, but he said he couldn't, that he'd heard someone speaking, said it was a man's voice, low, deliberate, repeating the same words, not yet, not yet. By the time I reached St. Frieswide's, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of stone and river fog. A single light burned behind the chapel's stained glass window, the one depicting the martyrdom of the sainted and gold shards trembling across the wet grass. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. The candle at the altar burned unsteadily, though there was no draught. And then I heard it soft, rhythmic, more breath than sound. The voice Jenkins had described. It came from the gallery above, near the organ loft. I called out quietly. The sound stopped. When I climbed the narrow stair, the air thickened. Dust rose with each step, carrying the scent of wax and wood polish. The gallery was empty. Only the faint glow of a reading lamp remained, its cord trailing down like a root. On the stand, open to the hymn, "Abide with Me." Beside it lay a tape recorder, the old kind, heavy, mechanical, its reels still spinning. I pressed stop. The voice ceased mid-phrase, but its residue hung in the air. I rewound the tape, pressed play. The sound that emerged was not haunting, but human Voss. His voice, clear, steady, unmistakable. Speaking as if to an unseen congregation, he said the fellowship had gone too far, that he had made a mistake, that the boy's death was not meant to be the end. Then silence, followed by 3 words repeated, "Forgive us all." The recording clicked to an end. I stood there for a long time, feeling the faint hum of the machine beneath my hand, the lingering vibration of a man's remorse. It struck me then that the recorder had not been there earlier. Someone had returned to place it. Someone who wanted it was found, and by me. As I descended the stair, I noticed something glinting on the stone floor near the door. A small brass key. I turned it over in my palm. The number engraved on it is 12, the same as Voss's room. The college was silent. Even the rain had chosen to listen. I went back through the quad, the key cold in my hand, the fog clinging to the windows like old breath. Voss's door opened easily. The room had been left untouched since his death. The coroner's seal was broken, but the air inside was heavy with stillness. I turned on the lamp. The faint circle of light fell across the desk, the same desk where I had first seen the letter addressed to me. In the drawer, under the crossword, I found a small envelope marked only with a date April 2nd, the day before Lacey died. Inside, a single photograph shows Lacey and Voss together in the chapel, standing beneath the stained glass window. Both smiling faintly, their expressions distant. On the reverse, in Voss's handwriting, 3 words, "For the record." The phrase felt deliberate, rehearsed. I turned it over in my mind, the tape recorder, the message, the placement of the key. This was not confession, it was orchestration. A final attempt to curate guilt into meaning. When I left the room, the clock struck 1. The sound carried across the quad, rich and hollow. Jenkins stood beneath the archway, his face pale. He asked what I had found. I told him nothing that would help him sleep. Back in my flat, I poured a whiskey and set the tape beside the glass. The machine looked almost innocent now, as if unaware of what it contained. I pressed play again, though I already knew each word. The voice filled the room, weary, unguarded. It ended as before with the same 3 words. "Forgive us all." I switched it off and sat in silence. For the first time since the case began, I felt not curiosity but pity for a man who sought truth in confession and found only the echo of his own voice. Oxford slept outside my window, its bells muted by fog. Somewhere in that fog, perhaps, the dead still rehearsed their lines. It was some weeks later when the last thread came loose. The term had ended, the students had gone, and Oxford had retreated into its habitual silence, a city that sleeps with one eye open, dreaming of itself. I thought I had put it all away, the diary, the tape, the letters. But memory has a way of lingering, especially here, where every echo seems to ask a question you no longer wish to answer. The morning light was thin that day, strained through mist and the faint smell of damp leaves. I walked through St. Friddeswyde's once more, not as an investigator, but as something else, an unwilling pilgrim retracing his own steps. The chapel was open, empty, save for the faint trace of wax in the air. I sat where the boy once sat beneath the stained glass and watched how the light gathered on the floor, red, then gold, then nothing. It was there that Crow found me. He looked older, though not by years. Grief ages differently in the young. He said he'd come to collect a few belongings before leaving Oxford for good. There was a pause between us, one of those silences that carry more truth than words. He asked if I believed what they'd said, that Voss had taken his own life. I told him belief was an occupation for other men. He smiled faintly, a gesture that hurt to see. Then he said something that held me still. The night before Voss died, he'd left a note for Crow as well. 3 words. Keep the light. He hadn't known what it meant until now. I asked him what it meant to him. He said only that perhaps the fellowship had begun as a search for truth, but ended as a fear of it. He left soon after, his footsteps fading into the cloister. I stayed a while longer, letting the chapel return to its solitude. When I finally rose, I noticed a small mark on the pew beside me, a faint carving in the wood, initials intertwined AL and QV. It looked old, older than the case itself. I ran a finger across it. The grooves were shallow, hesitant, as though carved in secret. For a moment I could see them both there. The boy and his mentor, the scholar and his shadow. 2 minds drawn together not by malice, but by the terrible intimacy of understanding. Perhaps that was the truest sin of all, to see too much of oneself in another. Outside, the air was cold enough to make the bells sound brittle. I walked past the quad, where puddles mirrored the sky like small, uncertain truths. The porter nodded to me as I passed, his face unreadable. He said they were planning to close the old wing for renovation. Too many memories, he added, though he meant ghosts. At home, I took out the crossword from Voss's desk, the one I had kept, though I'd never finished it. The final clue remained Truth's last companion, 6. I stared at it for a long time, letting the possibilities drift through my mind. Regret, silence, reason. None fit. Then, without quite thinking, I wrote the word memory. It fit perfectly, though I was not sure why. I poured a whiskey and watched the light move across the glass, the amber fractured by shadows. Somewhere outside, a blackbird sang, sharp against the stillness. For a brief moment I imagined it was the same note the choir had once rehearsed in the chapel, an echo refusing to die. That night I dreamt of the library window, the one where the first note had appeared. In the dream, the paper fluttered once more against the glass, but when I reached for it, the words had faded, leaving only the faint outline of handwriting, long washed away by rain. When I woke, the city was already stirring, though it felt unchanged. I sat at my desk, wrote a single sentence in my notebook. There are no endings in Oxford, only pauses. Then I closed it. The case, if one can call it that, had never been about crime or punishment. It was about the fragile architecture of truth, the way it shifts when seen from different angles, the way light deceives by revealing too much. I finished my drink, let the glass rest empty on the table. Outside, the first chime of morning bells began to sound, low and weary. And as the echoes faded, I thought, not for the first time, that silence is the only confession that lasts.